Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our third week of sessions at this November's Healthcare World Festival. It's been a fantastic couple of weeks so far with some really strong audiences and some great feedback on the sessions we've had on the global healthcare systems recovery to coronavirus, on our digital health session, how to digitize your health system, and last week a fascinating debate on the need for clinical standards around the world. This week we'll start by focusing on some individual markets, and we'll start by looking at the US market, the opportunities and indeed the complexities of getting involved in working in US healthcare. The US, I've been quoted as saying before, is almost the opposite end of the spectrum from my own health system here in the UK. In fact, you could very much say that the US and the UK are opposite ends of the spectrum, with the UK having dominated by a single payer in the National Health Service and with a free at point of delivery health system that's delivered through taxation, as opposed to the US, where it's entirely down to the individual to make sure they have the relevant insurance coverage. And it's almost an extreme version of insurance on the basis that you have to think very carefully about the insurance that you have and what it covers and what it doesn't. I'm no expert on this matter, but I do have three experts with me in Ernesto Chinona from CSSI Life Sciences, Jennifer Catalano, who is with the US Trade Commission and spent 10 years at the regulators, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. And we also have an investor in the form of Shahab Fatazine from Lincoln International. Shahab, have I pronounced that correctly? He's nodding away, but he hasn't taken himself off.
Yes, it's fine.
Done quite well considering I didn't practice. We also have representing, I guess, you as the audience, and we have Matt Oram from Advising, who are a UK company who specialise in price benchmarking for the NHS, who have an interest in the US market and will help to kind of question around, hopefully, some of the things that you in the audience want to know about entering the US market from our three experts. You can ask your own questions as well. On your screen, at the bottom of your screen, you should see an email address, which will come straight through to me as the chair. And I will be able to put your questions to the panel as we go along. So without further ado, I guess I want to start, panel, by really asking your ideas, your thoughts in terms of how the US health economy is different from other global health economies. Because it is, I guess, I said at the start of the conversation that the UK is a white elephant health system in the respect that there's nothing else like it. How much is that also true of the US? Ernesto, can I start with you? You will have to admit.
Thanks, Dave. That's right. Absolutely. So I think that one thing that I learned during one of my trade missions to the UK when I was with the Department of Commerce was the market pull for in the therapeutic side anyway, for small molecule therapeutics and really solutions that the government in the UK is able to afford for their population as a whole. Given that it's a government-funded healthcare system compared to what we were actually producing in the U.S., which are typically, right now, it's skewing biologics and cell therapies and gene therapies, which are more often than not unaffordable for a government to supply to everyone in the population. And so I thought that was really interesting. So which hospitals were delivering, in the case of cancer drugs, for instance, more high-end drugs, who was eligible for that is very different in the UK versus who is eligible for that in the US, and the parameters that make one better than the other. They're just very different systems. And so it's important as innovators are considering entering the U.S. market to dive deep into those complexities, which is what we're here to do today.
So from that point of view, Ernesto, can you give us any kind of a summary of how the payer system works in the US? We know, certainly from a UK audience's point of view, we're used to a situation where we can walk into any hospital and expect to be treated. I mean, clearly that's not the case in the US. How does it work?
Right. So briefly, This is a private sector run healthcare system for the most part, where yes, the insurance companies need to then reimburse the healthcare providers for either a procedure or the use of some sort of technology or drug. And the way that works is that based on the procedure, there's a code, and then those codes are then used to get the payers, which are the insurance companies, to reimburse the providers. And so one thing to consider is, what is going to be my reimbursement strategy if I'm an innovator? How do I obtain those codes? Do they exist for the type of technology that I'm bringing to the market, or do I need a new one? In which case, it could be pretty challenging to do, given that the American Medical Association is the body that meets to determine which what codes are eligible for different procedures and new technologies. And of course, then whether the insurance companies are willing to reimburse for that. And that sometimes relies on having the federal government, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, on board in reimbursing for a technology to be able to get then the private sector to do that. So it is it is complex in that respect. It does work differently for the medical device folks than from the drug folks, and so not only getting reimbursement from an insurance company, but also, of course, getting into the hospital supply chains that are going to be using the technology and convincing them that there's a reimbursement strategy is going to be a little bit of a piece of the puzzle there as well. And so that's kind of the high level, if you will, overview of that. Hope that was helpful.
Can I add to the complexities that Ernesto mentioned?
Please do.
Yeah. So adding to the complexity that Ernesto touched upon is the fact that in the next 5 years, we're going to see an intensity in the reconfiguration of a lot of healthcare players in the United States, driven by the big pharma, for example. I foresaw this a few years ago, but I think it's going to probably reach a crescendo in the next 5 years of pharma companies reinventing themselves, spinning off businesses, and so on. We've seen a couple of them being announced. But the Abbott AbbVie case of a few years ago is going to be repeated, I think, with more intensity, and that creates a sort of a complexity in the market. And then I don't need to tell anybody on this call that the United States is undergoing some incredible divisions politically, and what impact are they going to have on healthcare, and how healthcare is reimbursed, and how healthcare is managed, and who it's provided to, and so on and so forth. That does not solve these complexities, but adds to the complexity. That's all I'll say.
I mean, just from your point of view, Sharp, I was wondering, in terms of this, I know when we were talking before the session started, I know you mentioned that you've worked in a number of different healthcare markets. Like I say, I talk about the UK and the US as being opposite ends of the spectrum. But how, from your perspective, how different is the US from a more, I guess, traditional insurance-led market? So if you say, for example, working in the Middle East, where you have a lot of corporate insurers, it seems to me that there is a greater level of complexity in the US system, even in some of those other insurance-led systems. Is that a reasonable assumption?
I think it's a reasonable assumption for your listeners and viewers to consider. But I think these discussions are a backdrop to people considering investing in the US, which was the theme of this. Of course, what we are discussing now is very important, very complex, and nobody's going to give a definitive answer to any particular question regarding this issue, but it's a backdrop. There are other considerations, I think, non-US companies that are planning to come to the US should be considering, and we'll get into that in the course of this session, I'm sure.
Definitely. Thanks for that, Charles. Jennifer, from your point of view, 10 years at the FDA and working with the US Trade Commission, what's your kind of takeaway? What's your kind of view? What do you think the things that overseas companies looking to enter the system need to know? What are the kind of the top elements?
The first thing that comes to mind is to think about the regulatory system, and that things that are approved in other countries are not necessarily going to be approved in the US. And sometimes, or many times, the US FDA is considered having more strict standards. So I can think of products that were approved in other countries that the US said, no way, we would never approve that here. Secondly, I think a big thing to think about is the supply chain. Where are products coming from, and which countries are importing from which other countries? So in the US, we have a lot of tariffs that were imposed by the Office of the President and Congress on China. So if you have a supply chain that depends on China, and you have a 10 to 35% tariff on top of any anti-dumping duties or countervailing duties, the cost of your product could be 400% to import it than what it would normally be. So you have to consider, how much does it cost in this supply chain to import a particular input or a particular product? And I would say, thirdly, there has been quite a bit of work by US regulators to harmonize with other countries. And that is an effort through the International Conference on Harmonization. And the International Conference on Harmonization has a lot of really good information on its website. And I would encourage any listener here today that has not gone to that website to just go and look at the documents and the international guidelines that have been harmonized, because it will make the business prospect much easier if something is harmonized.
So tell us a little bit more about this, the harmonisation activity. Does that encompass UK, US? Who is doing the harmonising?
Oh yes, that's an excellent question. The main bodies involved in the International Conference on Harmonization, especially when I was involved with it, were the US, the EU, and Japan. And of course, Switzerland, historically always neutral, has its own Swissmedic representation. But other countries are allowed to go and comment and participate. But those are the three largest business segments, and therefore those countries, the US, the EU, and Japan, have sort of these permanent sitting members that make and get together and negotiate the guidelines. And what I want to say about that body is that it's not only the US regulators. The US regulators have a seat in the participation in creating the harmonized guidelines, but also the industry is involved. So the industry will send representatives and they will participate, and everybody negotiates to make these guidelines.
That's really useful. So actually, from that point of view, does that mean that as a Japanese or an EU company, it's easier to enter the US market?
It would make it easier, yes, because the standards, all those people get together that I was telling you about before. All those countries and the regulators and the businesses get together to negotiate what the standard should be. And if you can make a standard for all three of those large markets, some of the smaller ones are probably going to follow on and say, well, we're going to adopt the ICH guidelines and their standards here. So yes, it would make it easier.
So that's quite interesting, Matt, because it leads me to talk to you a little bit. Having, as somebody who's worked extensively in the UK market, I mean, two questions really. I mean, firstly, from your experience of working with all sorts of device manufacturers supplying to the NHS, are most of them hitting EU regulations as well, and therefore would they find it easy to enter the US market?
Yeah, I would guess so. I mean, most of the providers that we deal with are multinational anyway, so they're the same providers that probably operate in the US already. But for the smaller organisations, yeah, there's a consideration there, isn't there?
Absolutely.
I'm really interested in listening to Jennifer around the regulatory side, because I think you kind of forget that sometimes. You're probably more concerned when you're thinking about entering a new market around the cost and what you're going to need to do that, and you sometimes forget about those other bits around the edges that could well increase the cost considerably and the time to enter a new market.
So the other question I wanted to throw at you, Matt, was having listened to those three sort of introductory statements from our experts here, as a UK company that's interested in entering the US market, does that frighten you off? What worries you most from what you've just heard?
I think what probably worries myself and my organisation, and probably lots of other smaller organisations, is just the scale of the US. I think that it's the scale thing. Like, it's taken us 15 years to get to know the UK system very well, and I think it's the scale, and with that scale comes cost, as I've mentioned earlier. So you instantly start to think to put boots on the ground if that's needed. There's a cost to it. Who do we go and talk to first? Where do we go? Where do we land? Which state do we go to? There's all these questions that I think many organisations have.
So let's throw that one as a question then to Ernesto. Ernesto, where do you land? Where do you go first?
And that is an excellent question, because what's interesting about the States is that the approach can really be daunting if you're going to try to take on all 50 states at once. And so breaking your approach to entering the US market by achievable milestones, like perhaps one of the clusters, if you will, is a little bit more manageable. And so there's a couple of ways to find information as to, what cluster is best for your company. Certainly the Department of International Trade of the UK, as well as the Embassy of the UK in Washington, DC, have healthcare experts that are well acquainted with the strengths of each of the individual biotech hubs in the US, if that is of interest to a company. And it's really about starting local. And so I'm based in Baltimore. My network is locally the National Institutes of Health, as well as the Johns Hopkins and the University of Maryland, and kind of the medical systems that surround that. And so it's about understanding, in one state, who do I talk to about, if it's a medical device company, about approaching a hospital supply chain executive and a group of physicians perhaps who may be interested in my technology. And so economic development is going to be a first stop. So either the Department of Commerce of the state, in my case, it would be the Maryland Department of Commerce, for instance. They would be able to point you in the right direction as to who to talk to, depending on your technology. They have the Office of Life Sciences, and so they're well equipped to make those connections, as well as the industry organization within a state. And so it's typically what we call the bio affiliate. And so it's going to be the organization that is part of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, otherwise known as bio.org, based in Washington, D.C. They're the advocacy group of the industry. Every state has an affiliate. In our case, for example, would be the Maryland Technology Council. So they're going to be well acquainted with the folks in the healthcare system here that would be able to point you in the right direction. So that's going to be more on who you're finding clients, and then on establishing a business. oftentimes people incorporate in Delaware, just given the wealth of laws around business that are there. Doesn't mean that you need to be based in Delaware. And I think it's just a place where, yeah, it's just a place where people incorporate. You can get a business license to operate in any state. And typically that's, even though sometimes that could be pretty daunting, it's actually quite easy to get a business license for the most part. And so the states tend to be incredibly business friendly. There's either, sometimes it's a website, which is a form that you have to fill out, and then there may be some sort of annual fee for a business license. In Maryland, it's about $300 a year, and so it's not overwhelming. And then getting the connection to kind of the local real estate folks. And again, economic development will really help you find where that is and what's most convenient, and then of course plug you into all the wonderful incentives that come along with that. Go ahead. Yeah.
So maybe on to Jennifer then. I guess my next question on that would be, which should I think about first? If I'm a company wanting to enter the US market, do I think about the business opportunity first, who I can sell my product to, or do I need to think about regulation first?
It's like a chicken and egg question. In order to sell in the US market, you will have to have a license given by the FDA. So you can't start selling if you have an FDA regulated product. That being said, not all products are regulated by the FDA. So things like nutritional supplements, not regulated, so go right in. But if you're going to have a biologic or a drug or a device, you're going to need a license. So if you need a license, I would start at the FDA first and get that approved, because you can't sell otherwise. Now you can do a clinical trial in the US, and you can get permission to perform your clinical trial within the US. And once you get your application approved and you've done your clinical trials and you have a license to participate in the US market, then one of the things that business people like to do is go and see if they can get reimbursement from the Centers of Medicaid Services. I mean, there are other payers, but it's kind of a really big win if you can get reimbursement through Medicaid, because they have such a large chunk of the US market, if you're thinking about things in terms of a pie chart and where to go. Things that can help one get into the FDA and kind of be successful are, they have these companies which specialize in helping you get your application through the FDA. And those companies, if you're not used to the US system, you're not used to US regulators, you can go and hire a person to help you and sit with you through some of these FDA meetings where you're arguing back and forth on whether your product can start clinical trials, or if it's a device and you don't have clinical trials, to be approved.
Matt, you had a question you wanted to put, I think, to Jennifer.
Yeah, just that alone, Jennifer and Ernesto, has been a really interesting 10 minutes. I think I'm sure a lot of viewers have learned a lot from that alone. I guess I was thinking, we've talked there about product. What about digital services? So I'm actually not selling a product, but I'm selling more of a service. Is that, I guess some of those are also covered by FDA and some aren't. It'd just be interesting to get a view from yourselves on more of the digital side rather than the product.
Sure. And the answer to that is, it depends on what the product is. So let's say you're, I don't know, building a web interface or something. Okay, that's probably not going to be regulated. But what about those people that are creating a computer program that hooks up with a heart device that is implanted into someone? So if you have software that's regulated to like a medical device or a medical application, that would need approval from the FDA. So the answer is kind of bifurcated. Do you have a product that somehow relates to something that goes into a person? And another example is, are you creating a software program for genomics, which is an algorithm that goes into the DNA that has to do with a test to whether you get a treatment. Okay, that's going to need to be regulated. But if you're not sure, like if you say to yourself, this is a gray area, I'm not sure whether this is regulated, you can actually write to the FDA and they will tell you, yes, this is regulated, or no, this is not regulated. But if you're just building like some people build like an information service, nah, you're not going to need, you're not going to need FDA approval for that.
So Jennifer, on that then, I mean, we had a very, very successful session last week at the festival on digital health, and we talked around the idea that there are so many apps and triage apps. There are wearables around kind of monitoring long-term conditions. We have appointment making apps. Take a couple of. If I take a couple of examples, can you just give me a kind of yes or no? So, for example, if I've got something like in the UK, there's a system called Babylon, which is an online mobile phone based appointment making, see your GP on screen. So remote consultation app. Would that require FDA approval?
I don't think so.
Okay. What if we were talking about an app that provided mental health support? So text-based mental health support, online counselling. Would that require FDA approval?
Probably not. However, if you're ever confused, you need your get out of jail free letter from the FDA, go have your company get one and say, look, the FDA said I don't need to be regulated by this. And then the company can sit peacefully. But really it has to do with, is it related to a health decision for the human body?
So, for example, I mean, the other one that is quite prevalent is using wearables to monitor long-term conditions. So, for example,
that's a little different. So that's a little, so for example, I know that there are devices that monitor, say, they use a light beam to measure the sugar in your body. So you're measuring what is the glucose in the body, and that may result in a decision of whether or not to take insulin, just to give an example. That you're going to need the device to be approved by the FDA because it results in a medical decision to give insulin or not. Mm-hmm. Something like that, yes.
But ultimately, the advice is ask the FDA, and if you don't, then you get a nice letter that means that you're then free and clear to operate and to do what you need to do. Brilliant.
If I were a company and I were CEO of a company, I would want my nice letter saying this is not regulated.
That's really helpful, Jennifer.
And one thing, I'll just give one more piece of advice. One thing that you could do is there's a database called CROSS, almost like the Christian cross, right? But if you type in CROSS database into Google, you'll come up with the decisions made on different products and whether they're regulated by the FDA. So let's say I want to know if my light sensor device for glucose is regulated. You go type it in the database and it'll come up with the trade classification. So there's a number that gets associated with that device. And if it is regulated and the decision, there's like these judges that sit around and says, okay, if you got your little light device that comes in under number blah, 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 and the number is the judgment, right? And it'll also say this is regulated by the US FDA and they should be consulted for any further advice. So that you don't even have to, you can just do that right now at your fingertips. You don't have to go. But if it's an innovative product, then you want your letter, right? Because it's new and you don't know what it is and it's this new weird thing. But if it's been around for a while, you can surely use the cross database to help you and see if it has been regulated in the past.
And of course, if you have a competitor that's already working in the US market, you can go and see what decision was reached by the FDA in terms of that competitor's own products. That's really, really helpful.
And the FDA does have a database. So it has its own database of all the letters that it has sent out. So you can go to the FDA website and type in the product or the company, and you can see what letters have been sent out by the FDA on that company. That's a really helpful website as well. And that's different from the cross database, which is the cross database is like, it's run by customs, the federal customs agency, but the FDA is really nice that it has its own website and its own database where you can go look up things, especially about your competitors.
Very useful thing to know about your
If
competitors.
I may jump in and support something Jennifer has said, I'd made a list of about 8 things foreign companies should consider before coming to the US, but clearly the FDA is one of them. But in support of what Jennifer has said, I think it's very important. Some companies, non-US companies that come here, they try and work around the FDA rather than work with the FDA. They hire a consultant to advise them, this and that. The only person who gets rich is the consultant in situations like that. I think it's important to work with the FDA head on, as Jennifer correctly pointed out. And I think that's a very critical component of some of these 8 or 9 steps which I had listed for entry to the US, but that's just a support.
Well,
Jennifer
if we miss any of those other 7 steps, Shahab, at any point during this conversation, please make sure we backfill them later. Matt, I want to come to you just for a second while we're on this topic around regulation. From what you've heard from Jennifer and from the other members of the panel, your experience obviously is in the UK, where the equivalent is the MHRA. Does it sound to you as though we have an equivalent level of regulation in the UK, or does it sound like we're talking about 2 entirely different systems?
I think it sounds very similar in a way. You can't launch a new pacemaker without it going through some regulatory approval. So I think we have a very similar scheme. So yeah, I think we are very similar.
I mean, also from that point of view, Jennifer, just coming back to you for a moment, I don't know how familiar with the UK MHRA you are, but what's your perception in terms of the difference between not just the UK, but other regulators around the world and the FDA? I mean, I mentioned the MHRA only because my suspicion is that probably the MHRA and the FDA between them are probably the 2 strongest regulators in the world. Is that your perception?
That is my perception as well. And I would say if I had to pick where in the world I thought that the US was most closely related to in terms of its decision, it would be the European Union. And there are a lot, and it helps that a lot of people in Europe speak English, right? And they can get together on these Zoom meetings and do conferences. So when I was at the FDA, we did a lot of harmonization just between, at that time it was the EMEA. We did a lot of harmonization type calls with just Europe to see where they were thinking. And we would brainstorm together on some of these very complex regulatory issues, particularly with combination devices where you have a drug and it's also got partially a biologic and then it is hooked up with a device. Some of these things are very complex in their nature and how to regulate them. So I would say yes, that would be the closest thing to the FDA would be in Europe.
I mean, it's interesting because it relates actually to a conversation. I've done quite a lot of work of late in the Middle East, and there's one particular conversation that I recall in the last few weeks with a company who will remain nameless who wanted to enter the Dubai market. And they were worrying about regulation. And I said, well, what markets do you work in at the moment? And they said, well, we're approved for use in the US and the UK. And I just laughed and went, well, if you're approved for use in the US and the UK, you can probably go pretty much anywhere. So moving on a little bit from the regulation point, Shahab, I want to come to you first on this next point. Ernesto there has talked about getting yourself set up in terms of, getting set up as a business in the US. Jennifer's talked a little bit about getting the regulatory side set up. Assuming you've got those 2 things in place, obviously one of the key questions here is around what the needs are of the US health economy. What do you perceive to be the big areas of demand in healthcare in the US at the moment?
That's a very broad question, Steve. I think, if you're talking medical devices, it's a different answer. If you're talking therapeutics, it's a different answer. If you're talking diagnostics, it's a different answer. So I can't give one answer to that. But I think the biggest issue, if somebody can solve or help solve the issue of cost, I think that would be where I would encourage non-US companies to put their focus on in terms of innovation, in terms of looking at ways to enter the US market. And I think anything that brings down costs would get a lot of attention, both in the market and in the federal regulatory agencies and so on. So that would be my generic answer to a generic question.
I think that's a beautiful way of Shahab telling me that I'd asked too difficult a question there. Thank you very much for that. But it's an interesting one, and I want to delve into it a little bit more because I think that it is a fascinating piece, certainly from the point of view of where both myself and Matt sit in the UK health economy. Because at the end of the day, here we are sitting in a system which is renowned for being a value-based healthcare system, and one in which the cost of delivery is the first and most important question. And I guess I'll go to Ernesto on this one, if I may. Just thinking about it from the point of view of the UK-US relationship, how is the UK and the UK NHS perceived by the American market?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, and I do want to get back to your other question as well, but I think that because the NHS being a federal system in the UK, it's almost as daunting as trying to enter because I mean the federal government can be so big. How do you enter a federal healthcare system is especially federal hospitals, and that's rare here. And so those kinds of questions certainly pop into the minds of American innovators that are interested in entering the UK. In terms of what is of interest in the US, like Shahab said, it's a difficult question depending on the type of technology, but it's some things to consider are if there are any special designations at the FDA for your type of technology, or really for the indication of that technology, the indication meaning the specific disease that the technology will address. Sometimes you can get a platform drug that is really efficacious in multiple solid tumors, and the innovators don't know which tumor type to say, this is going to be a drug for glioblastoma, even though it works for pancreatic and lung cancer as well. How do you choose that indication? That is something to consider, given also not only any sort of special designation at the FDA, but also the appetite of the investor community. There are indications that have burned investors over and over, that even though they solve an unmet medical need, might be difficult to fundraise for, given that they're not really being considered right now, or they're just less favorable, if you will, to the majority of the investor community interested in the pharmaceutical market. And I think Shahab is probably better poised to speak on that than I am, but those are some factors to consider, at least for early stage companies.
Well, let's throw that one back to Shahab for a second then, I guess, to kind of finesse the question slightly. If I have a particular technology or service or device that I'm interested in bringing to the US, how would I go about testing the market to understand whether there is a need for the thing that I'm trying to sell?
No, that's a very excellent question, Steve, and it's very to the core of this conversation. What I will say is experience I have picked up in the last 35 years of doing investment banking in the healthcare business is that if you have a very good device, if you have a device that you think is the best mousetrap ever invented by man, The cautionary note is that does not guarantee success in the US market. Because one of the things we haven't touched upon is that when medical practitioners in hospitals are used to doing something with an older technology, it's very difficult to wean them off that to something new. And it may take a generational change for them to accept a new technology. So this is one of the most difficult things when you try and analyze the US market and entry to the US market that I think has to be considered, which is adaptability to new technologies by the marketplace. Regardless of how good the technology is, that's not the point. And I think, as I said earlier, the biggest mover of some of these built-in biases, of course, is anything that reduces cost. That may get the attention of people a bit sooner rather than later.
An interesting one.
To add something to what Matt said earlier, very, very important. And that is that the US market should not be underestimated. And I don't think people should just look at it and say it's a big market, it's a sophisticated market, and we should dive right into it. Because I think most foreign entrants into the US market find themselves undercapitalized. They grossly underestimate the cost of opening this market to their product. So make sure that the capitalization issue is fully understood and discussed at board levels before you dive into this market. And touching on that, I think a gradual rollout is a very important strategy for foreign entrants into the US market. And it ties into the capitalization issue. But I think smart entrants into this market have always done the gradual rollout, as opposed to say we're going to tackle the whole market at once, because there are also regional differences between acceptability of a product in New England versus the Southwest and so on and so forth.
So to be very direct about that, Shahab, if I'm say, for example, let's take the example of the kind of mobile app companies that we were talking about a moment ago. If I've got a digital triage product, for example, and I want to enter the US market, even in a gradual way, how much time and how much money should I be thinking about putting aside in order to do that properly?
Well, I think again, it depends on the size of the market that one is addressing. But I think the capitalization issue is a very important one. I would say you should overcapitalize rather than undercapitalize, and that leads to. I mean, it sounds self-serving, but I really mean this in the truest form possible. I think a very easy shortcut for foreign entrants into the US market, as a result of all the discussions we've had, is probably to make acquisitions to enter the market through an acquisition. You acquire a company that already has FDA approval for its products that's compatible with yours. You're buying a company that already has access to end product and markets for its products. You have an acquisition target that's already been approved by hospital systems. These are the types of decisions I think that has to go into how do you enter the US market. Acquisition should be a very important component of it, together with what you said, Steve, the capitalization issue, etc. I think that should be part of the discussion.
But of course, for a small innovator, there is no, they're not going to have the kind of money to be able to make an acquisition. Is there an option? Is there an opportunity for a smaller innovative company to find a way of getting their own niche in the US market? Jennifer, you got your hand up. Do you want to answer that one?
I have a couple of ideas, and one of them, if you're a small company and you can't afford to just acquire or buy another company, is you could get a distributor or an importer, and some of the importers already know how to import things, and the distributors know the US system. And this is something that, the US International Trade Commission worries about all the time. Who are the importers? Who are the distributors? And what kind of distribution network do they have? And you can set up deals with the distributors to go through, if you sell this much, you get this much of a percentage off the product. And in that way, you're making forward deals, not like, well, I'll pay you this much money and you can do this. It's like, no, they get a percentage, and you can do some of these deals and make contracts like that.
So coming onto that, actually, rather neatly, sort of slots into a conversation that Ernesto and Matt and I were having only a couple of weeks ago. So how, to test the idea a little bit, if we were to partner, Shahab talked about acquisition, but what about the idea of partnering, say, a UK supplier that wants to enter the US market with a US supplier that wants to enter the UK market, so that they can mutually help each other into their individual markets? Jennifer, would that work?
It could. I mean, there are all kinds of different deals made in every way that you can imagine with these distributors and their distribution network. So you'd have to, it would be a case by case thing, but that's an innovative idea, and it's done in some cases.
It doesn't solve the regulatory issues, Steve and Jennifer. I mean, a UK and a US company trying to cooperate, it doesn't circumvent the regulatory issues that Jennifer was discussing earlier.
It doesn't, but at the end of the day, I mean, I suppose I come from the point of view of, my kind of, a lot of the work that I do as a kind of market entry specialist. I do a lot of work, for example, helping companies to enter the Middle East market. I've helped companies to enter to enter African markets. And the advice that I always give to anybody is it's a hell of a lot easier to do it as a group or in partnership with people than it is to try and do it on your own. And I guess that in itself is a distillation of what you were saying a moment ago about acquisition. If you're working with people who know and understand the market in the first place, and you're working, if you can't acquire, in partnership with an organization that does something which complements your own offering, then actually, and I guess this is one to fire back to Jennifer as the regulatory expert in the room, they're going to be able to help you, are they not, to overcome some of those obstacles to getting FDA approval. Is that fair to say, Jennifer?
Yeah, one of the things I want to mention is that not all consultant companies are created equally. And there is a huge difference in quality in the companies that I have seen as that are labeled consultant in the US. So you have to look at what has this consultant company done to really help. Do they specialize in devices? Do they specialize in biologics? Do they specialize in drugs or combination products? What has been the history? And I think you really have to do your homework and see, when you're trying to partner or do a deal with someone in a different country, what is the experience and the history, and really check that out before you get involved. That would be my advice.
And that in itself, actually, I think is a great advert for Ernesto and CSSI, who do a great job, and also for the trade agency for Healthcare World, because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do in the first place, is to help set up those kind of networks with organizations that we've seen helping people to enter new markets. Matt and I have been talking about doing something similar, in fact, from the point of view of helping people to enter the UK market. Shahab, I can see you kind of waving your hand, very keen to come in.
Yeah. You have correctly quoted me about acquisitions, but I think that should be viewed in a overall basket. When I say acquisitions, it has different permutations and combinations. For example, it could also be to be acquired rather than to acquire. So that could be one iteration. The other iteration is, you could be an add-on product line to an existing company, so that product could be sold rather than the entire company. If it's a young company, which you had referred to earlier, one way to consider selling the company, but realizing the promise of the product that you're selling is to have earnouts associated with the. So there are so many different combinations in that rubric of M&A, which I think I just wanted to address.
No, and I think that's an absolutely perfect point. And Esther, I'll come to you in a second. I just want to just prod that one a little bit more, because Shahab also, as an investment banker, as somebody that's invested in healthcare in the US, I guess there's also that point around being able to go and seek investment, not selling your whole business, but perhaps selling a stake in your business through an investor, and that investor may be able to work with you and help you to work with other companies that they've invested in. Is that another route to look at?
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Steve, you hit the nail on the head. The early stage investors, the venture capital type investors in the US who like the early stage companies, over the last 5 years have increasingly gone out of the US looking for opportunities to put their money to work. And the UK, I would say, is a priority stop for them. So if most of your listeners are from the UK, that's something to consider. If it's a slightly more advanced company, some of the private equity companies in the US may have a portfolio company. This would be an add-on to them, and they like to invest minority positions sometimes. If the product is very innovative and take it upon themselves to address the issues that Jennifer had mentioned earlier, using their capital and so on. So, yeah.
So, Ernesto, I'll come to you in a second. Matt, I'm then going to come to you for a sort of comment on what we've heard in this part of the debate and any questions that you've got. But first, Ernesto, to you.
So I was just going to add on to what Shahab said in terms of being acquired. I see that more often than not from companies trying to enter the US market. They have either an asset that they'd like to sell or license out to partners. And sometimes the question is, when is the appropriate time to reach out to a company, a big med tech strategic or a big pharma strategic, for them to consider my asset. And we've worked with a lot of companies that have really promising technologies in development. And it's been our experience, and it's been the experience of some of our clients as well, that the big larger strategics say, that's great, thank you, but come back after you have regulatory approval. And so if you're one of those companies that are seeking that avenue to enter the US market, it's typically going to be at least for medical device, generally after some sort of 510K designation, or after a drug company is IND enabled, and typically after probably some phase 1 clinical trial data, that then the larger strategics start considering the assets a little bit more seriously. And so what I'm trying to say is regulatory approval just gets you to the starting line, if you will. After that, then you're now ready to compete with everybody else who's trying to get the attention of these big, larger partners.
So I guess what you're saying there, Ernesto, what I'm reading from the three of you, in fact, is that it's very much chicken and egg. In the respect that, as Jennifer said when I asked the question earlier on, you've got that question of, do I look for a market first or do I look for regulation? Jennifer's advice, look for regulation first. But at the same time, and from what you're saying, if I need investment in order to get into the marketplace, I may need regulation. But isn't it going to cost me an absolute fortune to get regulation and to get through the regulatory process? And why would I spend that money without the knowledge that I'm going to have a market at the end of it? Sorry, Ernesto.
Well, I mean, and certainly there are investor groups that will put money into a company that doesn't have regulatory approval. that is still in the product development process. In order to de-risk the asset, typically there needs to be some sort of plan, and so typically any regulatory, well, most, I would say most well-known regulatory shops can certainly build that strategy for you so that it's very clear what the costs are going to be to get to that first value inflection point after regulatory approval, and how long that's going to take, because it's going to be that timeline that's going to be when your investors are going to get their return. And so there are investors that will support that effort, if they feel that the company understands, what that trajectory looks like. But they are also assuming that risk, and so in terms of what does that market look like afterwards, and so there are ways to do market research, and there are shops that specialize in market research as well. Like there's shops that specialize in reimbursement. And so, and to Jennifer's point, not all consultants are created equal, and so it is tricky to find perhaps the right consultant. It just takes time to get to know the companies and to do the homework. But there are people that can help you better understand and answer those questions.
So, and I would always take the point, and again, I'm thinking about what I've done in other international markets, about the first thing that you do is you get out there and talk to people. You get out there with people like all three of you, in fact, who can put you in touch with the hospital groups, who can put you in touch with the insurers, so you can have the conversation and literally say, look, are you interested in my product? Is the thing that I'm trying to sell going to be of interest to the market? And of course, that's something that I know that we can help people to do. Matt, I want to come to you, just really for comment on what we've been talking about the last 10 or 15 minutes. Again, coming at this from the point of view of representing, I guess, companies that want to enter the US market. What's your take on what you've heard? How would you go about trying to enter the market, given the things that we've been hearing over the last 10, 15 minutes?
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting. For me, just listening to some of the conversation, our own experience, I think what we've found the best, whether it's in the US or elsewhere, like we've done a stint out in Australia, is it's partnerships. So what it actually is, it's understanding which are the companies that already exist in a market that might do something similar, or they're the buyers are the same of the product or service, but they don't do things quite the same as we do. So actually we could complement their service in country. Likewise, there are things that they offer, let's say in the US, that we could bring to the UK, and through that partnership we could do that. So I think we ourselves have found that the most, not necessarily the easiest, but the most useful, because it's meant the costs are lower. We're not looking, as Shahab's mentioned, about all the cost and recapitalising the business. And actually those conversations, as you've said, Steve, it's the conversations and talking to folk that has been the most useful for us.
And I think that brings me on actually to the next point that I want to come to, which is that question about, if you're looking to try and find a way of proving your business model, whether it's a service, whether it's a product, whether it's a drug, one of the things that is going to be fairly foreign, if you'll pardon the expression, to a lot of companies that are coming from overseas into the USA, is this question of remunerations. And I want to come to Jennifer on this first, because you touched on this in your sort of opening piece. You talked about Medicaid and Medicaid approval. And how that works. So getting Medicaid approval for remuneration. Can you just speak a little bit to how that works and what it is specifically that you were talking about?
So I had been mentioning that a lot of businesses who eventually get a product approved by the FDA would like to have reimbursement from Medicaid, because they are a very large payer in the United States. And so the strategy will, almost be three-pronged. It's like, 1, your regulatory strategy, 2, your reimbursement strategy, and 3, your cost and profit strategy, like your marketing and all that together, sort of the business end of it. So it's kind of like a three-pronged strategy, and it's just a way to get, if you can win that reimbursement from Medicaid, you have won a large piece of the pie. Now you could go to non-Medicaid reimbursement companies, but you might be going, this little one, that little one, that little one. And so rather than do all these different meetings and go to one small payer and one small payer, okay, you can get some small wins that way. And that may be a way for your company to feel good about itself and say, well, we got one payer. And, it's just a strategy that is used to try to get that, because if you can get that, you're going to get paid, and it's easier.
I want to break this down. Actually, I want to really kind of simplify this. I mean, you guys obviously used to the US market, so you understand the language that you're using. I think some of our audience may not. When you're talking about, firstly, when you're talking about payers, you're talking about insurers. Is that am I correct? And Medicaid, for those who don't know it, is, well, just explain for those in our audience who don't know what Medicaid is, what it is.
So in the US, let's say you're a private citizen, and you don't have a lot of money. Well, what you do is you go down and you fill out a form and you say, I would like to have Medicaid. And it's usually if you don't make very much money. So if you make and there's a cutoff, and it's usually around the poverty line, and each state will determine the amount of money that you can make as a private citizen, whether you're going to get it or not. So you apply. And then the Medicaid office from each state, because there's a federal Medicaid system, and then that is run through the states. So let's say I live in Mississippi and I make $2,000 a year, and I send in my form. Well, I'm probably going to apply for Medicaid because I'm a poor citizen. If I make above that, then I can't get it. So if, let's say, I make too much money, I'm not poor, well, then I probably can purchase an insurance through my employer. I can do it privately. Like, I can go out and say, Blue Cross and Blue Shield, that's one of the major insurance companies here. I want to get Blue Cross and Blue Shield, so I'm going to pay my $500 a month as a private citizen to go and get Blue Cross and Blue Shield to insure me, a private citizen. Or I can go through my employer, like I in particular work for the federal government, so I look at the plans that the federal government offers, and I can purchase a plan that is offered and negotiated by the federal government with Blue Cross and Blue Shield or Aetna or any of these other insurance companies. That's what I personally do. And I pick which one I want from my employer. Now, Medicaid, they will often, you have to, sometimes they'll make you verify your income before you can get on it. So it's not like I fill out a form and instantly I can get on Medicaid. There's usually some sort of, approval process that might take a month or two. So once you get on Medicaid, you can get certain things reimbursed. Now, they just changed some of the federal rules, and they're constantly changing them. So if I were a business, I would be looking up the rules, particularly around dental care. Like Medicaid is not known for being a good dental provider. And so some people who are on Medicaid can only get, maybe if they're in severe pain, they can get their dental procedure covered, but that's changed. So the federal government said, okay, we're going to start reimbursing, root canals and things that we didn't reimburse before. And so it's a constantly changing system about what's on the list and what's not on the list. But you have to consider that Medicaid is usually for the poor people.
And Matt, you had a question on this, didn't you?
Yeah, I just listened to that thinking it's so different to in the UK with a taxpayer funded model where the hospital will decide on the products that go into patients in that particular hospital, clinical preference, whatever we call it. But it sounded like there, Jennifer, and correct me if I got it wrong, but it also depends on the insurer. So could I sell a product into the US through Medicaid, and Medicaid go, yep, we'll do that. Patient walks through the door. If they're not Medicaid, that product doesn't go into that patient because they're not a Medicaid patient? Is that how it works?
Well, let's say I'm a poor person and I go to the hospital. And I actually heard about this example. Let's say, for example, I knew a person on Medicaid, and this is a real example. I knew a person who lived in Virginia that was on Medicaid and went to the doctor and said, I have an intrauterine device. So it's a device example. And I want it removed. And the doctor said, okay, well, you're on Medicaid. And so what's going to happen here is here are the rules in Virginia right now, according to Medicaid where you live, is Medicaid will pay for the doctor to remove the device. It will not pay for anesthesia. So patient, do you want to suffer and have it taken out without any anesthesia, or do you want to pay $400 to get the device removed so that you won't be in pain? And then the patient had to make a choice. Okay, the rule is that Medicaid doesn't pay for anesthesia, but it pays for the device to be removed. So, if the patient was poor, and in this case, the patient was poor and said, go for it. I'm just gonna grit my teeth and hold on to my chair and go for it. And so that's what happened. So you get these types of individual decisions that have to be made at the patient level based on what Medicaid will pay for and what Medicaid will not pay for. Sometimes they pay for all of it, sometimes part of it. And it's just, you have to know what procedures are approved and which ones aren't.
I don't know about you, Matt, but my instant reaction to that story was thank God for the NHS. I guess then, Ernesto, I'll come to you on this point. That's what we mean. What Jennifer's been talking about there, that's what we mean when we talk about remunerations, isn't it? This is about ensuring that when you enter the US market with a product or a service, that you have had the approval from the insurer, whether it's a private sector insurer like Blue Cross or Aetna or Cigna, or whether it's a public sector insurer like Medicaid or Medicare. It's having the approval of the insurer that they will remunerate the hospital for the use of that individual product. Have I got that? I think it's really important for those people outside the US to understand this. Have we got that right? Can you expand on that?
And I think Jennifer did a beautiful job in explaining that and shedding some color to the complexity of the insurance system. In the private system, in the private insurers, like in Medicare, it's a similar issue. If you change from one private insurer to a different private insurer, they may not reimburse certain procedures or certain drugs. They may only reimburse for generics or a certain percentage of the drugs. And so, I mean, so the rules change as well between the private insurers. I think that one thing that's interesting is that if you do get the federal insurer, though, CMS so Medicare to reimburse, the members of a private insurer can certainly threaten to sue a private insurer, given that the public insurer is reimbursing. Why isn't the private insurer reimbursing?
So the point there being that if I can get this essentially paid for by government, then there is no excuse for a private insurer to hold back that particular device, therapeutic, drug, or whatever it may be. Is that right?
Well, there's many excuses why they could, but they certainly take it. Like it's certainly a strong argument for why they should reimburse. There's a lot of like an insurance company will certainly generate many excuses why they shouldn't reimburse you for X, Y, and Z. That's their job, and so but it's a tough argument to defeat if the public insurer is reimbursing. And Jennifer, do you agree with that? I think I've seen that part of the strategy there as well.
Yes, it is. It's hard to be a private insurer and say, well, uh, it's hard to deny someone coverage if CMS has said we are going to cover this, because CMS is sort of known for Medicaid anyway, because it's for the poor people. You know, it's sort of bare bones. It's really kind of survival and what they need. And gosh, if those people are covered, if the Medicaid people are covered, we're going to look really bad if we, as this private company, are not going to make that decision.
Just to be clear on this one, and then I'll take a question from Matt, and then I've got a question for Shahab. But before we get on to that, firstly, Jennifer, CMS. I've heard this come up a couple of times. What is CMS, just for the benefit of our audience who won't have heard of it?
So CMS, I guess the important distinction to make here is that it's a the United States federal government agency that makes decisions to reimburse or not. Okay. And it's different from a private insurer. So say Blue Cross or Blue Shield, when public, you know, they could be on the stock market exchange or something, but it's a non-governmental.
So CMS is the department that operates Medicaid, is it? The federal department?
Yeah, it's the federal department, and their headquarters is in Woodlawn, Maryland.
The other question, again, before I go to Matt's question, just because it's the other thing that people outside of the US may have heard of but may not understand the distinction of, is you have Medicare and Medicaid. What's the difference between the two?
Yes. So Medicaid is for people who are poor. I mean, there's a number set at how much income you can make. Medicare is for older people. So you have to be at a certain age, and I believe it's 65, but it's pretty much, you know, they might change the cutoff a little bit, but it's for old people.
And again, is that a federal insurance?
Yes,
for old?
That's a federal government insurance.
I think thanks very much. I know.
And the reimbursement is different. So the Center for Medicaid Services may choose to make a decision for Medicaid, and that decision could be different for Medicare.
Mm-hmm. Apologies, by the way, if this feels a little bit like you're giving very basic information. I know that our audience will not understand. Sorry, Shahab, did you want to say something?
A good way to remember: aid, care.
Yeah, absolutely.
Care, you know, poor people, aid. Yeah.
Absolutely. Matt, you had a question you wanted to put.
Yeah, it was just, we were talking earlier around if you have a product that delivers great value, how it will be easier to get it into a new country, and we're talking about the US. So in the NHS, I kind of get that because it's a taxpayer funded model in the main. I know there is a bit of private work, but in the main it's taxpayer funded. There's a finite amount of money. We try and deliver the best care possible for that money. In an insurer-led market, how does that work, in the sense that as long as the individual's paying their premiums, who cares? So how do you get through that? Is it easier to sell a product based on value in a taxpayer-funded system versus a insurance-led system?
Shahab, do you want to take that
one? We've touched on some of this, Matt, here and there in the course of the past hour. I think from a private insurance point of view, if a product is approved and it's utilized, I think there are cases where the insurer will assign a certain product. Say we'll reimburse you if you do X. So there is specificity there at times, but it's different from the Canadian and the British system in that sense.
Yeah,
but one thing I was going to just say, we've talked about consultants and so on and so forth. I think before we forget or the time runs out, I think it's important to refresh some of the foreign non-US listeners entering the US market. I think a piece of third-party advice that's very useful, especially as it pertains to IP protection, as well as all the regulatory hurdles and so on and so forth, is probably good counsel. I think there are law firms there are many law firms in the US. It's a very litigious country, so there's a yellow pages of law firms. So, but there are ways of getting advice as to what would be a good law firm to get you on the right path, as opposed to going straight to consultants.
Very, very useful piece of advice, actually, that, Shahab. Matt, did you have a follow-up there?
No, for me, it was just understanding how you assess value in terms of, we know from price benchmarking across countries that the US tends to pay a lot for the same products compared to other markets, and just understanding that dynamic. I think what you were saying, Shahab, is it's almost to some degree, it doesn't matter too much as long as they stick it on a list and they're willing to pay for it, then they'll pay for it. And it's just, where's that test to say, okay, we'll pay for it, but it's actually 5 times cheaper in the UK for exactly the same product from the same supplier. So where's that test take place in the US market?
Yeah, that's a $64 million question, Matt. I think it's a very, very good question. I think we are maybe 2 decades away from a global approach to healthcare providers. For the procedure that you want, it's cheaper to do it in Dubai. So we will pay for you to go to Dubai to get that. We're not there yet. But I think, in a couple of decades, there will be a seamless way of doing that on a global basis. Yeah.
We do work, Shahab, on that around Europe, where we do know there are some procedures that take place in Germany, and the cost to do it in Germany, it's actually cheaper to put patients on a plane and fly them to France, have
Correct.
the procedure in France and fly them back, than it is to do it in Germany.
Correct.
A great advert for our medical tourism session in a few weeks' time.
Yeah.
So yeah, no. The other point actually that I think is worth coming into the conversation between Matt and Shahab here is actually Matt is not asking these questions out of idle curiosity, are you, Matt? Because at the end of the day, this is precisely the service that you would like to provide to American healthcare providers, isn't it? Is price benchmarking them, helping to get better value for money.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's what we do, is spend analytics. We look at products and prices paid around the world. I think for many markets, it comes back to the so what. How are you going to change it? We had that experience out in Australia where we saw they were paying a lot more, but everybody just felt powerless to do anything about it. It's just the price the market pays in that particular region. So it's trying to understand how you break some of that down to actually drive better pricing or more standardized pricing.
And that probably is a conversation you should have with Shahab, given the fact that he was talking earlier on in the conversation about US market entry being something that should be, thinking about things that drive price down. Shahab, I want to come back to this question of remunerations, if I may, and the question of insurers. From your point of view as the commercial guy here, how would you advise new entrants to the market to go about approaching insurers? How do you get yourself on that list of items that are subject to remuneration?
Well, if the product is validated and the product's under review at the FDA, I think that's a good time for communication with some of the providers, some of the insurers. I think that will come up in the conversations. And Jennifer may correct me if I'm wrong, but the FDA is not unconcerned about something being covered or not. I'm not sure. I mean, it's not their job, but the FDA is certainly aware of some of these limitations.
The decisions are independent of Medicaid's decision. It's a scientific decision.
Yeah, independent, but yeah, okay.
The two things presumably have to go hand in hand, right? Because there's no point in having a product that's approved if the insurers are not going to pay for it. In fact, Ernesto, let me come to you on this one, because it feels to me as you know, I'm a salesman at the end of the day. I sell things to people, and it feels to me like I've got a really complicated job selling my product into the US, because I have to sell it to the regulator, I have to sell it to the insurer. Do I also have to sell it to the hospital, to the clinician, to the provider? How does this work?
Sure. So, I mean, and just to kind of go back to what you were saying, I mean, the FDA is not really going to take whether you have a market for your product or not into consideration, because, like I said before, regulatory approval gets you to the starting line to be able to compete, and so it may be a hit, and or it may completely flop in the U.S. market. But there's no way to know that because you're just getting started. And so in terms of what to do, and how do you approach hospital systems? In my experience, talking to hospital systems in Maryland, it's a bifurcated approach. Typically is the best approach. So having a physician champion is one thing. And meeting physicians, typically, hopefully KOLs in your area of expertise, which are found at scientific conferences, as well as clinical conferences, having them talk about your product and champion your product is always valuable. Hopefully a physician champion within the hospital system that you're trying to enter. And the second part of that is, of course, your supply chain executives. And so the folks in the hospital system that are going to be making the decisions as to whether the product will be purchased by the hospital, or even considered as part of the hospital's arsenal of technology. And so if you have a physician champion, and then you have a supply chain executive that looks favorably upon the technology being presented to them, it will go, in some cases anyway, in some hospital systems, at least the ones that I know of, it goes to an internal committee of both the supply chain as well as the physicians, and they typically test run that product for a little while to see if it does what it's supposed to do. There's certainly conversations around reimbursement. There's certainly conversations about the demand of the hospital system. There's a local hospital system here that reached out to me. They were looking to bring in-house their dialysis because they were outsourcing that to a company that was doing all of that. They wanted to, so then they were in the market for that technology, and so they were going out and pursuing that. And so it's challenging because every hospital system is very independent from every other hospital system, and then within hospital systems there might be 6 to 10 to 20 different hospitals, each with their own needs, and each with their own supply chain executives that are making those decisions. And so similar to what Shahab was saying earlier, is you want to start, small, and then enter one, and then get some business, and before moving up and around to other hospitals.
So if I'm right, and I know Shahab and Jennifer both want to come in on this point, just to clarify that, right? So what you're saying there is getting your regulatory approval gets you to the start line, and then as a salesperson, you have to sell to the insurer and you have to sell to the hospital system. That's the way I understand that. Shahab, you wanted to come in, and then Jennifer.
Yeah, I wanted to say that, we've covered a lot of different topics and so on and so forth, but in terms of timing, in terms of decision-making, entry into the US, etc., there are examples of European companies that established their business model in Europe. They set the roots down in Europe, and when it was fully understood and so on, it's then that they decided to attack the US market. So a good case in point is a clinical trial CRO in Ireland called Icon, for example. They went public a long time ago. maybe 25 years ago, with a market cap of about $70 million. They're now in the hundreds of millions of dollars, but they established their brand in Europe. And then now they have a huge US operation and so on. So that's one example. And then, of course, if you're well capitalized, obviously the giants are giants. I mean, in April, Siemens paid $16.5 billion to buy Varian, which was a diagnostic company, for some of the reasons we said, because of regulatory and other access to markets and already established sales force for the product and so on and so forth. Compatibility with Siemens' sales force. That's the other end of the spectrum. That's
so 16.5 billion. So if you're going to get into the US market and you've got 16.5 billion lying around,
that would help. Yeah,
that would help. Absolutely. Jennifer, you wanted to come in.
I was just going to say, in the everyday world, there is an army of people called pharmaceutical sales reps. And these are often masters. They often have a master's degree in science, and they know something about the way a drug would work. And these people are usually paid, $60,000 to $100,000 a year, and they're sent out by pharmaceutical companies to go knock on the door of doctors and follow them around and hunt them down and make them listen until they try some samples and get the product going in some patients. And some of these companies will also invite doctors to very fancy dinners because their time is very valuable. And then they give these medical doctors, fancy dinners and have them listen to a lecture or presentation by another MD that is the champion, and get them to listen so that the product will be used by the doctors.
So basically, all I need to enter the US market is $16 billion and some fancy dinners. Who knew it was that simple?
We could have had a 10-minute call. You're right.
Listen, we're running out of time. It's been an absolutely fascinating debate, and I think the $16 billion and fancy dinners is probably not the right advice that we need to give to companies entering the market. We've got about 4 minutes left. I'd like each of you to give me your one most important one-sentence tip, please, on entering the US market. Shahab, I'm going to come to you first.
I would say understand the market. The US is not one market. It's a very complicated market. Regulatory, insurers, the state of the market, price, costs, etc. Understand the market. It's what is my one advice.
Ernesto, to you.
I would say to not do it alone. There are a lot of us here that are here to help and to support your company's goals to enter the US market. And so there's no need to trailblaze when there's already a very clear path of us that know how to do that. And so see meaningful partnerships. It'll save you a lot of time and money in the long run.
Jennifer.
I would echo that and finding regulatory help, but I also wanted to mention a report that was produced by the US federal government, and it's all about the international trade of the supply chain for COVID-19 goods. It's called COVID-19 Related Goods, the US Industry, Market, Trade, and Supply Chain Challenges, and it goes through supply and demand of many different products, and it helps one think in this conceptual framework of supply and demand and who's producing what in the US and what is the demand. It's produced by the US International Trade Commission, and I recommend it for fun reading.
Put you to sleep if nothing else. Thanks for that, because I think that's the one that you put in the chat in the call. We'll try and make sure we get that email there to everybody who's watching. Matt, to you last. After what you've heard today, do you still want to do the US market, or has it frightened you off completely?
No, I think that's not simplified it, but made it easier to understand. And to echo what Ernesto said is, don't sit there worried about you're going to have to do all this alone. There are people out there to support, and there's very knowledgeable people. And I know I was a participant of the panel, but I've learned a lot from this session as well. So there might be a final thing, which is just listen to this conversation back. It's 90 minutes. If you forget it, just listen back to it, because actually it covers most of the bases. And actually the people on this panel are all experts in their various areas, and just reach out to folk and talk and not sit there worrying.
I think that's brilliant, Matt. And I think, all that I would say, brilliant panel, brilliant debate, really, really interesting. I've learned a lot as well. I think the key takeaways for me, considering the three elements, the three different elements that you've got to think about. It's that kind of triumvirate of regulation, of remuneration, and of market. That's the key thing, and experts, I think, here in all of those areas. It only remains for me to thank Shahab, Ernesto, Jennifer, and Matt for their company this afternoon, for what has been a fantastic debate. Really, really enjoyed it. There will be more tomorrow. Tomorrow at noon GMT, we have a session on entering the Middle East market. So I get to think about our whole new health economy and how you figure that one out. And I hope I don't get the two things confused. Whether 16 billion and nice dinners with doctors will help you in the Middle East as well remains to be seen. We also finished this week, I can't recommend this one highly enough, on Thursday, on a session on the global workforce, at which our very special guest is Jim Campbell, who is the head of workforce of the World Health Organization, as well as the co-author of the book Human on the workforce crisis, Charlotte Refson from KPMG, and Jed Byrne from Health Education England. So that's a cracking session. Got to get my plugs in for those. But thanks again, brilliant panel. If you'd like to know any more, if you'd like an introduction to any of the members of the panel, please do get in touch with us. I think this is a topic that we will come back to time and again, and I'd be really, really keen to start building bridges to the US market. Thanks for your company this afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you at the next session. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.